A cast-off mother and her two daughters cling to life in the cold shadow of betrayal. A widowed rancher, burdened by silence and sorrow, finds them when he isn't looking. Between them lies a valley of pain, and the chance to build something no one believed they deserved. Some rescues come on horseback, but not all saviors wear a badge. Pull up a chair, friend, boots off, kettle on, and let the fire warm your bones. Out here in Sycamore Ridge, stories settle in the floorboards like dust, and some are worth telling slow. It was June 6, 1887, the summer sun baked the red clay roads, and the preacher's daughter, Miss Eliza Carrington, rode bareback through town like she owned the wind. Folks said a proper lady shouldn't gallop alone, much less chase after the blacksmith's boy. But Eliza never did mind rules, especially the kind written by men who'd never loved wild or true. And Lord, was she about to. Sometimes, the family you choose is the one fate blows in with the storm. Out here, past the last telegraph line and beyond where the map curls into guesswork, folks don't talk much of mercy. The land don't give it, and most men forget how. You learn to keep your back straight, your words few, and your pain packed down deep like winter stores. In the West, a man's silence can be a shield, or a prison. And a woman's cry often don't carry farther than the walls of her own house. But every now and again, the wind changes. A storm rolls and that ain't just snow and thunder, it's people. Lost, hurt, lookin' for one more chance. And if you've still got a fire lit inside you, well, maybe you let him in. This story starts on a night like that. When the cold nearly swallowed 3 souls whole, till a man with a scar and a silent house opened his door. The wind had a sound to it that winter, not just cold, but mean. Like it had forgotten how to whisper and only knew how to scrape bone. Snow drifted high against the fence rails, and the creek behind the bluff hadn't moved in near a week. Frozen stiff. The sky sat heavy over Elk Valley, gray and sullen like a horse that had gone lame. Cade Mercer didn't mind the silence. In truth, he leaned into it. His cabin sat alone at the edge of the pines, half a day's ride from town, and even farther from any kind of company. It was a sturdy thing, built by his own hands 10 winters back, one window facing east, the other always shuttered. Inside, it smelled of pine smoke, oilskin, and something older. Memory, maybe. Most mornings came the same. He'd rise before the sun, pull on his worn coat and boots, and pour coffee dark enough to stain teeth. Then he'd feed the mule, break ice in the trough, and count heads in the cattle pen. Always alone. Always quiet. There was a photograph nailed above the mantel, faded with time. A woman and a boy, both with eyes that pulled soft at the corners. Cade hadn't touched the frame in years, but he looked at it some nights, usually after the fire burned low and the whiskey glass was near empty. He kept their room closed. Folks in town still whispered about him when he came in for supplies. Said he used to be a decent man before the fire took his family and left him with nothing but a scar on his cheek and a dogged way of looking past people instead of at them. But Cade didn't much care. He didn't owe the world his pain. Out here, a man learned to live with what was lost. His only companion these days was Flint, a dapple-gray gelding with more sense than most men. And even Flint, loyal as he was, knew better than to push too close. The days were short now. The kind where the sun never really broke through, just cast a dull glow like lantern light behind smoke. The kind of days when even the mountains seemed to brace themselves. And Cade Mercer, well, he was braced too. Against the cold. Against memories. Against anything that might come knockin'. The wind shifted around midday. It started as a stillness too sharp for comfort, the kind that made a man pause with his hand halfway to the barn door. Birds had gone quiet, not a wing in the sky. Even the trees, tall and stubborn as they were, stood still, as if holding their breath. Cade Mercer narrowed his eyes at the ridgeline, jaw tight. He'd lived through enough winters to know what was coming. By late afternoon, the clouds had rolled in like a slow stampede, low and thick, gray smeared over the mountains. He could smell it in the air, snow, heavy and wet. Trouble. He brought the cattle down from the back pasture, locking them close, then doubled the hay inside the barn. Flint stamped nervously, sensing something wrong. By the time Cade barred the door, the first flakes were fallen. Big, slow-moving, and plenty of them. The fire crackled in the hearth. He sat near it, stripping and oiling his rifle by lamplight, the warmth seeping through the soles of his boots. A stew bubbled soft in the pot, and for a minute, there was peace. Then Flint's whinny broke through the storm. High. Sharp. Urgent. Cade stood like a man shot through the heart, tossed his rifle onto the bed, and grabbed his coat. The wind punched him in the face the moment he opened the door, snow already piling fast against the porch steps. He raised the lantern and stepped into the white. The storm howled, blinding and wild. Snow sliced sideways across the yard. Beyond the fence line, something moved, dark shapes half buried, crawling. He staggered forward, boots crunching against the crust of ice. A woman. Face down in the snow, her dress soaked through and frozen stiff. A bundle clutched to her chest. Another small figure behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, shaking. Cade dropped to his knees. "Ma'am," he barked, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. Faint pulse. Barely there. The older child stared up, eyes wide, red from windburn and fear. A little girl. Couldn't be older than 4. "Please," she rasped. "Mama." Cade didn't think. He moved. He hoisted the woman across his shoulders, cradled the baby under his coat, and reached for the girl's hand. "Hold tight, darlin'," he said, teeth clenched. "Don't let go." The snow tried to take them, but Cade pushed through, one heavy step at a time, back toward the cabin. Back toward the fire, the door slammed shut behind them, snow whirling in on their heels before Cade shoved it back against the wind. He dropped the bar into place and turned to the room, now half-lit and full of breathless silence. The woman lay limp on the floorboards, her dress frozen stiff in places. The little girl still clung to Cade's coat, her cheeks raw and wet with tears that had half turned to ice. The baby, no more than a few months old, let out a weak, mewling cry from the folds of Cade's duster. He moved quick. Years of working cattle in sub-zero taught him there wasn't time to dawdle when cold got this deep in a body. "Easy," he muttered, more to himself than them. He stoked the fire high, then fetched the thick wool blankets from the cedar chest. He stripped off his coat and tossed it over a chair, steam rising from the soaked leather. Then he knelt by the woman, unwrapping the baby and pressing his rough hand to her tiny chest. Still breathin'. Barely. He laid the infant in a basket by the hearth, stuffing it with dry towels, and turned his attention to the woman. Her skin was pale as new snow, lips near purple. Cade hesitated, then pulled his knife and cut away the frozen parts of her dress, not out of indecency, but necessity. He rubbed her arms and shoulders with coarse flannel, trying to coax blood back into her limbs. "You're all right now," he said low, not sure if she could hear him. "Ain't no one gonna hurt you here." The girl watched from the fireside, arms wrapped around her knees. "You got a name?" he asked her gently. She sniffed, nodding. "Clara." He crouched beside her. "All right, Clara. I'm Cade." "That your mama?" She nodded again. "And that's Junie," she whispered, looking toward the baby. "You hungry?" She shrugged. But when he set out a plate, half a biscuit, dried apple slices, and some warm milk, she took it with both hands and ate without looking up. Cade stayed up most the night. Every time the fire dimmed, he fed it more wood. Every time Junie stirred, he rocked the basket gently with his foot. Clara had curled into the bearskin rug, thumb in her mouth, asleep before the wind changed direction. Toward dawn, the woman stirred. Cade moved to her side as her eyes fluttered open, mud-brown and slow to focus. She tried to speak, coughed instead. He offered a cup of warm water and held it to her lips. "You're all right," he murmured. "Storm's still outside, but you're safe in here." She tried sitting up, grimaced, and looked around. Her gaze landed on Clara, then Junie. Her jaw trembled, but no sound came out. "You're at my place," Cade said. "Found you out past the fence line. Storm nearly had you." Her lips moved, voice barely a breath. "Thank you." He just nodded. The words weren't needed. For a time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of wind pressing against the walls. She looked at him then, not with fear, but the kind of suspicion that comes from a woman who's been hurt by too many men with strong hands and weak hearts. "My name's Lorna," she said, voice rough. He nodded again. "Clara told me." "And the baby?" She looked toward the hearth. "Junie. She's 5 months." Cade let the silence settle again, letting her breathe in the warmth, letting her body remember what safety felt like. Later, as he cleaned the basin, he heard Clara's small voice behind him. "Mr. Cade?" He turned. "Yeah, little one." She stared at the fire, then at her mama. "Are we gonna stay here now?" He didn't answer right away. Just looked at the storm still clawing the windows, and then at the quiet strength beginning to return to Lorna's face. "We'll see," he said softly. "But for now, this is where you are. And that's enough." Outside, the wind raged. But inside, the fire held. By the third day, the storm had turned the world to white and silence. Snow leaned hard against the windows, piled high on the roof, and swallowed the land in every direction. Cade figured the trail to town would be buried for another week, maybe more. Inside, the cabin lived different now. The quiet had changed. Clara's footsteps pattered where once there were none. Junie's soft cries broke through Cade's thoughts like distant thunder. And Lorna, well, she didn't say much, but her presence filled up the space all the same. She moved careful, slow, like a deer that hadn't yet decided if it could trust the hand offering salt. Cade wasn't used to company. Let alone the kind that brought with it such small, breakable lives. He caught himself watching them sometimes. Clara, helping her mama button up a borrowed flannel shirt that fit too big. Lorna by the hearth, rocking Junie with a soft hum that lingered in the rafters after she stopped. She was still weak, but her color had come back, and her hands didn't shake quite so much. Cade didn't press her with questions. Truth be told, he figured some stories carried themselves like bruises, deep, slow to fade, and tender to the touch. If she meant to tell it, she would. But one night, after Clara had gone to sleep and the baby lay dreaming in her basket, Lorna spoke into the firelight. "He told me he'd kill me if I gave him another girl." Cade didn't look over. Just kept feeding kindling into the stove, slow and quiet. "I thought he'd changed. Thought after Clara, after the beating stopped for a while, maybe he'd softened. But when he saw Junie, he lost his damn mind. Dragged me out past the cattle road and left me there. Said the coyotes could raise the lot of us." Her voice didn't crack. It was flat, spent. Like a riverbed long dried out. Cade sat back on his heels. "How far'd you walk?" "Too far." A pause. "The horse ran off. Clara walked beside me till she couldn't no more. I carried Junie the rest." He nodded. That explained the frostbite on Lorna's toes, the blisters on Clara's little feet. "I ain't a skin for anything," she said quickly. "We'll be gone when the road clears. I'm just grateful. You didn't have to stop." He looked at her then. Really looked. And saw what most men never bothered to, a woman near shattered, yes, but still standing. Still carrying 2 souls besides her own. "I didn't stop out of pity," he said simply. They didn't speak after that for a long while. Just watched the fire, listened to the wind slip down the chimney like a snake with nowhere else to go. The days passed. Cade fell into a new rhythm, though he never admitted it aloud. Lorna helped where she could, washing clothes in a basin near the stove, setting out dry beans to soak, sweeping the floor with soft, tired strokes. Clara shadowed him out to the barn, feeding Flint apples and asking questions with all the earnestness of a child who hadn't quite figured out the difference between danger and curiosity. "You got kids?" she asked one morning, brushing snow from her bonnet. Cade didn't answer right away. "Used to," he said finally. "Little boy. Jacob. Lost him and his ma in a house fire. Long time back." Clara reached out and took his hand, small fingers wrapping around two of his. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Cade cleared his throat and tugged his glove back on. "Come on. Let's get inside before your mama comes lookin'." That night, he dreamed of Jacob for the first time in years. Not the fire, not the smoke, but the boy's laugh, echoing through trees in spring. He woke before dawn and sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, eyes on the dark window. Maybe the silence had been too quiet. Maybe the ghosts in the house had needed company too. And maybe, just maybe, these girls weren't the only ones who'd been saved from the storm. By the seventh morning, the snow had stopped falling. The clouds hung back on the mountains, bruised and still, but the sky above the valley had gone clear, cold blue, the kind that bit at the lungs when you breathed too deep. The wind had calmed, and a hush settled over the land like the world was holding its breath. Cade stood on the porch, shovel in hand, boots buried ankle-deep in fresh powder. He'd cleared a narrow path from the door to the barn, though it wasn't much more than a dent in the drifts. The world outside looked almost pretty, clean, untouched. But he knew the kind of quiet that came after a storm. It didn't last long. Behind him, he could hear the soft clatter of pans, the low hum of Lorna's voice as she rocked Junie by the fire. Clara was laughing, real laughing, not the half-scared kind she'd come in with. That sound stirred something deep in him, something he'd packed away tight for years. They were talking about leaving. Lorna hadn't said it outright, but he saw it in her eyes. She folded clothes with more purpose now. Checked the baby's wraps twice. She'd found an old travel sack in the cupboard and had started setting things in it, little things. No more than what she could carry on her back. Cade didn't say a word, but it gnawed at him. That night, the fire burned low and the silence returned, not the easy, settled kind, but the kind that stood between two people like a closed gate. Lorna sat in the rocker, Junie asleep in her arms. Cade poured a second cup of coffee and sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hat still in his hands. She glanced at him. "We'll head out in the morning," she said, quiet but firm. "I know the trail to Three Pines. Might find work there. Maybe a place." He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the fire. "You sure?" "I can't stay here, Cade. Folks'll talk. You didn't ask for any of this." He looked up at her then, the lines in his face deeper in the firelight. "I didn't ask for you to show up half dead in the snow either," he said, voice steady. "But here you are." Lorna's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. "You don't owe me nothin'. And I ain't expectin' anything." But Clara's got color in her cheeks now. Junie's smilin', in her sleep. "This place, it's not much, but it's safe. You could stay. Least till spring." She studied him, as if trying to measure the truth in his words. "I can't live off your kindness," she whispered. "Not forever." "It ain't kindness," Cade said. It's something else." He stood, ran a hand through his hair, and turned toward the window, frost fogging at the edges. "Maybe the silence was too quiet," he said, almost to himself. "Maybe I thought I'd buried everything out here, and then you walked in with two little girls and brought it all back." She watched him closely. "I don't know what this is," he went on. "But I know what it ain't. It ain't a mistake. And it ain't something I'm ready to lose. The room was still. The fire popped once, sharp as a gunshot. Lorna rose slowly from the chair, careful not to wake the baby. She stepped close, her voice low but clear. "We'll stay," she said. "For now." Cade nodded once, the weight in his chest shifting, just a little. He didn't reach for her. Didn't press. Just stoked the fire again, the way he always did, and laid another log on the flames. Outside, the snow had started to melt, one drip at a time. Inside, something warmer had started, too, slow and unsure, but real just the same. Spring came slow to the valley. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, inch by inch, like a wounded animal slinking into the pines. The road to town cleared by April, though it remained soft with mud and patchy ice. Cade hitched up the wagon, patched the harness where the leather had cracked, and loaded what they needed: flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee. Lorna added a bolt of calico she'd been eyeing, though she said she wasn't the sewing kind. Cade told her she could learn, if she wanted. The sun sat high but the wind was sharp the morning they rode into Three Pines. Cade hadn't been into town since the fall, and he felt at the moment they hit the edge, eyes, glances, heads turning. Clara clutched his arm from the wagon seat, the brim of her bonnet drawn low. Lorna sat quiet beside her, Junie wrapped tight to her chest. She hadn't spoken much since they left the cabin. Three Pines was a small place, 2 rows of buildings, 1 church steeple, and more opinions than it had people. Cade felt them all brushing against his back like burrs in tall grass. He stopped outside the mercantile. Hitched the team. Helped Clara down. Inside, the warmth smelled of kerosene and dried tobacco. Old Mr. Jenks stood behind the counter, thick glasses perched on his nose. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Cade Mercer. Didn't expect to see you draggin' company behind you." Cade gave a slow nod. "Been a long winter." Jenks looked past him, eyes lingering too long on Lorna. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Just kept her chin up and her hand on Clara's shoulder. "Need staples," Cade said, keeping his voice even. "Usual order, plus feed for the mule." Jenks rang it up without a word, but his silence said plenty. Out on the boardwalk, Mrs. Eston from the church crossed the street rather than pass by them. The blacksmith's boy watched Clara like she was a 2-headed calf. Even the preacher, tall and gray, gave Cade a polite nod that didn't touch his eyes. "They think I'm your whore," Lorna said flatly, later, as they loaded sacks into the wagon bed. Cade stiffened. He didn't look at her. "You ain't," he muttered. "I know that. But they don't." She paused. "And they won't ask. Just keep whisperin' behind their hymnals." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not just at the lines worry had left on her face, or the way her hand trembled when she tightened the wrap around Junie, but at the fire beneath it. The pride. The defiance. "You want to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. I'm tired of running." He nodded once. That was that. Before they left town, Cade stopped by the hardware store. Bought nails, kerosene, and, on impulse, a spool of ribbon the color of spring lilacs. He handed it to Clara as they climbed back into the wagon. She clutched it like treasure, grinning for the first time that day. Lorna didn't say a word, but her eyes lingered on the ribbon, soft and sad and full of something he couldn't name. As they turned back toward the trail, Cade caught a glimpse of themselves in the dusty window of the saddlery: man, woman, 2 girls, 1 wagon. Didn't look like a rescue. Didn't look like a shame. Looked like a beginning. Even if the world didn't see it that way. The wind carried the first breath of summer through the cottonwoods. Wildflowers had begun to nod along the fence line, and the creek behind the barn ran fast with meltwater. Cade found himself rising earlier than usual, tending the fence before sunup, letting the soft murmur of a waking house reach him slow. Lorna had settled into the place. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet rhythms of shared days, fresh bread cooling by the window, Clara's dresses hanging dry on the line, Junie's soft coos drifting down the hallway. Her touch was everywhere now, though she never once claimed it. That morning, Cade watched her from the barn door, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled to her elbows, kneading dough like she was born to it. Clara sat at the table counting dried beans, making a game of it. Junie was asleep in her basket. He hadn't meant to speak, not just then. But the words came easy. Quiet, like dust on a saddle. You could stay. Lorna didn't stop kneading. I am stayin', I mean for good. She looked up. Wiped her hands on her apron. Cade, don't play with me. I ain't. He stepped inside, took his hat off, held it by the brim. I got no fine words, he said. Ain't never proposed anything in my life but a trade of horses and a fence line to my neighbor. She waited. But I been thinkin'. Thought it through plenty. This place, it needs more than one pair of hands. And those girls, he paused, swallowed. They've got a way of settlin' the bones. Like this is what home oughta feel like. Lorna's gaze didn't waver. Her hands rested on the edge of the table. You a-skinned me to marry you. I am. Outta what? Pity? Obligation? No, ma'am. Outta sense. Outta wantin' to build something steady. Somethin' that don't blow off with the snow. The silence stretched. She looked past him, out the window, where Clara was now outside chasing the hen again, giggling all the while. Don't expect romance from me, she said. Ain't got much left in that cupboard. I ain't expectin' it, he said. But I figure love grows same as anything, if you plant it deep and keep it tended. Lorna smiled, slow and unsure, like she hadn't remembered how. You'll treat those girls right? She asked. Already do. And me? He met her eyes. Always. She nodded, once. Then I reckon we've got ourselves an understanding. Cade breathed out, slow and solid. He placed his hat on the table and reached for her hand. They stood there, fingers entwined, quiet as the breeze that stirred the curtains. No grand vows. No gold ring. Just a simple promise, spoken with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much to lie. And in the corner of the room, Junie stirred in her sleep, smiling, like she already knew. 3 years passed. The valley rolled on with its seasons, snow in winter, sun and wildflowers come spring, dust and hard labor through summer, and the golden quiet of autumn. The days came steady, like the swing of a hammer or the hush of a newborn's breath. Cade's ranch wasn't much by the measure of some, 30 head of cattle, 2 good mules, and a stout barn, but it was theirs. The roof no longer leaked, the fence line held, and the cabin had grown by 2 rooms, framed and nailed by his own hands and Lorna's, too. She could swing a hammer better than most men he knew, and she wasn't one to let a beam sit crooked, not under her roof. Inside the home, life had rooted deep. Junie toddled now, all bare feet and wild curls, chasing chickens and tugging at the hem of Cade's coat when he came in from the field. Clara, nearing 8, read by lamplight and helped with chores without being asked. She still had the soft quiet of her mother but laughed more easily now. Real, belly-deep laughter that filled the corners of the cabin and made Cade pause mid-task, just to listen. Lorna had softened, too, but not in the way of weakness. The hardness she'd worn like armor when she arrived had eased into strength, sure and solid. She still watched the world with wary eyes, but now they crinkled at the corners when Cade kissed her cheek before supper, or when Junie brought her dandelions in a muddy hand. They moved through their days like a team well matched. Cade worked the fields, mended gear, and traded in town come Saturday. Lorna ran the home, oversaw the chickens and garden, and stitched Clara's dresses from fabric they picked out together at the mercantile. At night, with the fire low and the girls asleep in the room down the hall, Cade and Lorna would sit on the porch, his chair creaking, hers still, watching stars scatter across the black sky. "You ever think about the beginning?" she asked one night, her voice low as wind in the grass. Cade looked out across the land, past the barn where the lantern flickered in the window. "I do," he said. "You and them girls, half frozen. Thought you were ghosts when I first laid eyes on you." Lorna smiled, but it faded soft. "I weren't much more than one." "You're more now," he said. "You brought breath back into this place." She leaned into his shoulder, head resting there. "You gave us ground to stand on." A quiet settled again, the kind that came easy between folks who didn't need to fill every silence with words. The next day, Clara came back from the creek with a small, muddy stone, flat and heart-shaped, nearly perfect. "I want to keep it," she told Cade, holding it in her small hands. "Mama says it's good luck." He turned it over with calloused fingers, nodding. "Then we'll build it into the porch. Let it hold the door open." Later that summer, he set it beneath the threshold himself, tapping it into place with the same hammer he'd used to build the house. When Lorna saw, she didn't say a word. Just brushed her hand over his and stood there with him, watching the girls play in the sun. Cade never did take to calling himself a father out loud, seemed too big a word for a man who'd once lived only in the silence of snow and wood smoke, but he felt it, every time Junie climbed into his lap or Clara leaned against his side while he told stories by the fire. There wasn't a title for the kind of bond they shared. It wasn't just love. It was soil and sweat and firelight. It was second chances. It was a family formed not by blood, but by choice. And that kind of family didn't break easy. Not in the Wild West. Not in a place where storms came fast and men had to stand tall or be swept away. They had weathered their storm. And now, at long last, they were building something meant to last. Years later, long after the fence posts had grayed and the girls had grown tall, Cade Mercer stood at the edge of his pasture and watched the sun ease down behind the far ridge. The wind carried the smell of sage and dry earth. The cattle were lowing soft, drifting toward the creek where the grass still held green. Lorna sat on the porch behind him, shelling peas into a tin bowl, same as she had every summer evening since he could remember. Her hair had silvered some, and his back ached worse with each season, but the rhythm of their days hadn't lost its shape. He ran a hand over his jaw, rough with stubble, and looked back at the house, the porch light glowing warm, smoke curling from the chimney. Laughter rose from inside. Clara's boy, wild and loud like she'd never been. Junie chasing him, her skirts flying, voice high and sweet. And for a moment, Cade just stood there, still as the land around him. He remembered that first winter. The snow. The silence. The woman and her two girls half dead in the storm. He thought he'd been doing the saving then, pulling them in, giving them fire and bread and a roof that held steady. He thought maybe he'd been doing the right thing. Maybe even something noble. But looking back now, he saw it clear. They hadn't just survived that storm. They had changed the shape of his life. Lorna had brought warmth into the walls. The girls had brought laughter into the silence. And Cade, a man built more for fences than words, had found something like peace in the quiet of family. Not perfect. Not always easy. But real. He turned and walked slow back to the porch. Lorna looked up, smiled like she knew where his thoughts had been. He sat beside her, reached for a pea pod, and said only, "They sure did grow up, didn't they?" She nodded. And the fire inside flickered through the windows as dusk settled over the valley. Narrator, voice low, steady. He thought he was rescuing them from the storm. But it turned out, they'd rescued him.